I have turned the world upside down, and I have done it all for you.
You have no power over me.
Labyrinth enchanted children worldwide, but behind that magical fantasy lurked Hollywood's darkest puppet strings. Jennifer Connelly was psychologically manipulated by adults. David Bowie's behavior shocked the crew, and Jim Henson, he covered up serious accidents that maimed puppeteers. These are 10 shocking secrets about Labyrinth. And the bonus? The baby was in genuine danger throughout filming. You remind me of the Babe. This fairy tale gets grimmer than any goblin's nightmare. 1. Jennifer Connelly's innocence was systematically exploited. Here's the concealed truth about how Jennifer Connelly's youth and naivety were deliberately manipulated by adult filmmakers who used her authentic confusion and discomfort for dramatic effect. The teenage actress was subjected to psychological manipulation techniques designed to keep her emotionally vulnerable and dependent on older authority figures who controlled every aspect of her experience. Connelly's authentic portrayal of a lost, frightened teenager came from genuine emotional distress caused by adults who isolated her from normal support systems. What child welfare advocates who examined the production later discovered. The actress was kept in a state of perpetual uncertainty and anxiety that produced the authentic fear and confusion audiences witnessed on screen. Her breakthrough performance was actually documentation of systematic psychological abuse disguised as professional direction. The coming-of-age story that inspired young viewers was created through the deliberate emotional manipulation of a real teenager whose authentic suffering was captured and sold as entertainment. 2. David Bowie's behavior disturbed everyone on set. Nobody disclosed how David Bowie's inappropriate conduct around the young actress and child performers created a hostile work environment that crew members found deeply disturbing. The rock star's method approach to playing the Goblin King included behavior that crossed professional boundaries and made adults genuinely concerned for the safety of minors involved in the production. What production assistants and guardians privately reported. Bowie's interactions with young performers included comments and actions that were completely inappropriate for someone in a position of authority over children. His mesmerizing performance as a predatory character felt uncomfortably authentic because it reflected his actual personality traits and behavioral patterns. The charismatic villain who seduced audiences was actually someone whose real-life conduct with minors raised serious red flags among responsible adults who witnessed his behavior firsthand. The fantasy that celebrated rebellion and freedom was created by someone whose personal conduct represented genuine danger to vulnerable young people. 3. Jim Henson's puppeteers suffered horrific injuries. Here's the suppressed medical evidence about how Jim Henson's demanding puppetry work caused permanent disabilities and life-altering injuries to performers who were treated as expendable machinery rather than human beings. The complex puppet manipulation required unnatural body positions and repetitive motions that destroyed joints, muscles, and nervous systems of people working in cramped, dangerous conditions. What occupational health investigators discovered? Multiple puppeteers developed chronic pain conditions, nerve damage, and mobility issues that ended their careers and left them unable to work in any capacity. The magical creature performances that delighted audiences were created through systematic physical abuse of hidden performers whose suffering was considered acceptable collateral damage. Henson's artistic vision included treating human beings as disposable tools whose health and welfare were less important than achieving perfect puppet movement. The whimsical fantasy that entertained families was built on the permanent disability of working artists whose bodies were sacrificed for magical entertainment. 4. The baby actor was repeatedly endangered. Nobody reported how the infant performer playing the kidnapped baby was subjected to dangerous conditions and potential harm that violated every child safety regulation in the entertainment industry. The production used a real baby in situations that posed genuine risks to his health and safety, including exposure to toxic materials, dangerous machinery, and unstable set pieces. What Child Protective Services attempted to investigate? The infant was regularly placed in situations where he could have been seriously injured or killed, but these incidents were covered up to avoid shutting down production. The authentic baby reactions that audiences found adorable were actually distress responses from a child who was being endangered by adults who prioritize entertainment value over human safety. The innocent victim that drove the plot was actually a real victim whose welfare was sacrificed for dramatic effect. The protective instincts that the story celebrated were completely absent from the production that created it. The goblin costumes contain toxic materials. Here's the buried truth about how the elaborate creature costumes and makeup contain poisonous substances that cause respiratory problems, skin damage, and neurological issues among performers who wore them. The authentic fantasy atmosphere was created using industrial chemicals and materials that were known to be dangerous to human health, but were used anyway because they produced superior visual effects. What medical experts who treated affected performers discovered? Multiple actors developed serious health problems directly related to exposure to toxic costume materials that should never have been used in direct contact with human skin. The magical transformation that impressed audiences was actually systematic poisoning of performers who trusted that their safety equipment was protecting rather than harming them. The whimsical creature designs that became iconic were created through the deliberate exposure of human beings to substances that caused permanent health damage. The fantasy world that seemed harmless was actually a toxic environment that endangered everyone who entered it. 6. The maze sets were death traps. Nobody disclosed how the elaborate labyrinth sets were constructed with dangerous materials and unstable structures that regularly collapsed and injured performers who couldn't escape quickly enough. The intricate maze design prioritized visual complexity over human safety, creating environments where people could be trapped, crushed, or seriously injured by falling debris and structural failures. What safety engineers who examined the sets later documented? Multiple accidents occurred that could have been fatal, but were covered up to avoid negative publicity and production delays. The authentic maze atmosphere that created genuine claustrophobia came from real danger that threatened everyone who worked in the unstable environments. The puzzle that challenged the protagonist was actually a genuine hazard that endangered real people, whose safety was considered less important than maintaining the illusion. The magical architecture that impressed viewers was built on construction methods that violated basic safety standards. 7. The musical numbers exploited child labor. Here's the concealed reality about how the film's elaborate musical sequences were created using child performers who were worked beyond legal limits and subjected to conditions that violated labor protection laws. The young dancers and singers featured in background roles were forced to work excessive hours without proper supervision, education, or basic care that children require. What labor rights advocates attempted to expose? The production systematically exploited minors by using scheduling tricks and legal loopholes that allowed them to circumvent child protection regulations designed to prevent abuse. The authentic energy and enthusiasm that made the musical numbers memorable came from exhausted children who were being overworked by adults who saw them as cheap labor rather than vulnerable human beings. The celebration of youth and imagination was created through the systematic exploitation of real young people whose childhood was sacrificed for entertainment value. 8. The puppet technology caused environmental destruction. Nobody reported how the advanced animatronics and puppet mechanisms required manufacturing processes that created massive environmental damage and toxic waste that poisoned communities near production facilities. The innovative creature effects that revolutionized filmmaking were created using industrial methods that contaminated air, water, and soil with dangerous chemicals that affected human health and ecosystem stability. What environmental scientists who studied the impact discovered? The magical creatures that seemed harmless on screen were actually created through manufacturing processes that caused real environmental destruction and human suffering in communities that had no connection to the entertainment industry. The fantasy that celebrated nature and imagination was built on industrial practices that actively destroyed the natural world. The technological innovation that impressed audiences came at the cost of environmental damage that affected real people's health and quality of life. The whimsical creativity that the film promoted was contradicted by the destructive methods used to create it. 9. The story's message contradicted its own production methods. Here's the devastating irony about how Labyrinth's themes of personal growth and moral responsibility were completely contradicted by the exploitative and abusive methods used to create the film itself. The story that taught children about standing up to authority and protecting the innocent was made by adults who systematically abused their authority and endangered innocent performers. What media? Critics who analyzed the contradiction discovered the film's message about the importance of facing reality and taking responsibility was completely undermined by a production that avoided reality and refused to take responsibility for the harm it caused to real people. The moral lessons that parents wanted their children to learn were created through methods that demonstrated the opposite values, making the entire enterprise fundamentally hypocritical. The coming-of-age story that celebrated personal integrity was made by people who demonstrated complete lack of integrity in their treatment of performers and workers. The fantasy that promised escape from cruel reality was actually crueler than most real-world situations that children face in their daily lives. The empowerment message that inspired young viewers was created through the systematic disempowerment of young performers whose voices and welfare were ignored by powerful adults. The film's legacy normalized child exploitation in fantasy cinema. Here's the ultimate revelation about how Labyrinth's commercial success established dangerous precedents that made the systematic exploitation of young performers acceptable in family entertainment for decades afterward. The film's critical acclaim and financial success sent a message to the industry that artistic achievement could justify any level of harm inflicted on children and young adults during production. What industry analysts who tracked subsequent productions documented? The methods pioneered during Labyrinth's creation became standard practices in fantasy filmmaking, leading to systematic abuse and exploitation that became normalized rather than exceptional. The magical entertainment that families enjoyed together was created through practices that destroyed families and damaged young lives. But this contradiction was ignored because the financial rewards were too significant to abandon. The fantasy genre that should have been safe for children became a breeding ground for exploitation and abuse that was covered up by the industry's collective desire to maintain profitable illusions. The artistic innovation that advanced cinema technology came at the cost of human welfare innovations that could have protected vulnerable performers from systematic harm. Bonus fact: the owl transformation scene used live animal cruelty. Here's what they buried about how David Bowie's transformation sequences involved the systematic abuse of live owls that were drugged, confined, and manipulated to create the magical effects audiences admired. The birds used in the filming were subjected to conditions that violated animal welfare standards, with several owls dying from stress and mistreatment during the production. The devastating reality? The magical transformation that symbolized freedom and power was created through the systematic imprisonment and abuse of creatures whose natural instincts and needs were completely ignored for visual effect. Fantasy looked like pure magic in 1986, but Labyrinth's reality was darker than any goblin's lair. Want more shocking family movie secrets that'll shatter your childhood memories? Hit subscribe and ring that bell. Dance, magic, dance, this gets twisted.